So this is McGraw-Hill Anatomy and Physiology Revealed. Excellent virtual dissecting tool with huge amounts of animation and interactive things that really make learning human anatomy and physiology fun. So just had to give a shout out to Anatomy and Physiology Revealed, McGraw-Hill. Hello everybody, this is Mr. Walters, and we've been talking about different regions of the brain. And just a quick review, we've got the cerebral cortex here, and then notice we have the cerebellum. Here would be the frontal lobe. So this just happens to be the left side of the brain. Notice left side of the brain. And the left side of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, has to do with a lot of the thought processes that make us human, that separates us from other animal species in terms of our intellect. So this would be our rational, logical, analytical side. That would be the left prefrontal cortex. Also notice what we have here. This would be the parietal region here. Notice this is the lateral sulcus, which separates the frontal from the parietal. Notice the sensory region here, and notice the motor region here. Other points of interest, again, here is the hearing input, hearing interpretation. We have speech center here. We have reading, and then we have the occipital region with visual input and visual interpretation. Now notice, now we can look at another section. This would be a mid-sagittal section. And again, notice the corpus callosum, which allows communication between the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. Notice this region here, the diencephalon. Then we've got the brainstem. Again, we can break down the diencephalon into the thalamus and hypothalamus. The limbic system is also another important part of that. The brainstem itself can be separated into three regions. We have the midbrain, the pons, and then we have the medulla oblongata. Again, we're going to talk about these structures and more in some detail. But quickly, I want to talk about maybe these trillions of nerve cells that make up the brain and the spinal cord. And we've got a supreme computer processing system here. The brain is going to receive stimuli ultimately from the outside world, process that stimuli in complex ways. Take some of that information stored in short-term memory. Take some of that information stored in long-term memory. Take some of that information, or a lot of that information, not stored at all. There's a lot of things out there when you're walking, when you're taking a walk, and a lot of people are taking a walk these days. You should be also. It's about mental health, physical health. Get out there and exercise. So when you're out there taking a walk, there is a huge amount of information out there, visual information, for example, which is not essential that you take in, store, process, and save in short or long-term memory. So the brain cells are going to work together to store information, but they also are going to be selective in leaving information out, because we would be overloaded with stimuli if your brain was trying to process and put those files into long-term memory. So we concentrate on the important stuff. What's the important stuff? This class. Oh, yeah. So notice on the left here, we have an example of convergence, where two separate neurons are going to send nerve impulses to one neuron. This neuron is going to receive chemical communication and come up with a sort of sum that results from these two neurons and their associated communication. What could happen here, let's say this inhibits, let's say this facilitates, but this receiving neuron is going to take a summation of both of those and then elicit an appropriate response. Notice here we have divergence. So we have one nerve cell here, and that nerve cell here is sending chemical communication to a receiving cell here and another receiving cell here. The complexity with which these neuronal pools works is fascinating and awe-inspiring. The magic of a child's ability to master the multiplication table is a miracle. It is a God-given miracle. And that's just the start. Okay, so this is a good review of some of the things that we've already talked about, but we'll be adding a few things as well. So I will pause when I want you to add some of the functions that we haven't talked about. For example, we'll be talking about the function of the cerebellum here. So look, listen, and we'll be taking notes when I stop the presentation.
The brain is divided into 4 regions: the cerebrum and cerebellum, and the deeper lying diencephalon and brainstem. The cerebrum consists of 2 large hemispheres whose surfaces are distinguished by thick folds called gyri that are separated by grooves called sulci. Each cerebral hemisphere is composed of 5 lobes. In a lateral view, the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe can be identified. The 5th lobe, the insular lobe, cannot be seen on the lateral surface. Each lobe is responsible for specific functions. Overall, the cerebrum is considered the seat of intelligence, responsible for information processing, language, personality, and conscience.
Okay, so we've already talked specifically about the different lobes and varying functions. So for example, we talked about the occipital lobe as being important for visual input. I do expect you to get that from the previous video. You need to take good, detailed notes when I was using the model. But let's get this as well. So cerebrum, these are more general functions. We have information processing. Talked a lot about that. Language we've talked about. Personality and consciousness. These different regions of the brain are working together, giving you a consciousness and a personality. Of course, your personality is based upon a lot of environmental happenings as well. The environment helps mold your personality. But get these.
The cerebellum is composed of hemispheres with many folds. Its primary function is to coordinate motor activities.
Okay, get that? Coordinate motor activities. Also write smooth muscular movements. So smooth muscular movements. Think of a ballet dancer or LeBron James. Oh yeah, I'm a LeBron fan. Bring it on. So smooth muscular movements for cerebellum.
Structures covered by the cerebral and cerebellar hemispheres can be seen best in a mid-sagittal section. The diencephalon is composed of the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus.
Okay. Thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. That is the diencephalon. If you haven't gotten that from the earlier video, get it now. And there they are, diencephalon. That's that general region. Notice thalamus, hypothalamus, hypo means under, epithalamus. Notice that hypothalamus is associated with that master gland. If you follow the hypothalamus down a little bit and to the right, we get to the master gland, the pituitary gland.
And epithalamus. The thalamus is a major processing and relay center for information entering the cerebral hemispheres. Ventral to the thalamus is an area called the hypothalamus. It has a primary role in homeostasis, including regulation of body temperature, food and water intake, sleep and circadian rhythms, emotional responses, and memory.
All right. Get the functions of the hypothalamus. Now that's a pretty good look, but I also want you to add a couple. Make sure you put control of movements and glandular secretions of the stomach and the intestine. So that's control of movements and glandular secretions of the stomach and the intestines. Another important function, production of neurosecretory substances. So production of neurosecretory substances that stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete hormones. Here it is again. Production of neurosecretory substances that stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete hormones. So obviously, really important.
The epithalamus is dorsal to the thalamus and has two parts. The pineal gland is an endocrine organ, while the habenula is a relay center between the midbrain and limbic system.
Okay, so get the two regions of the epithalamus. So we have an endocrine structure here, so it's not all nervous system. Same way with pituitary gland right here, endocrine. And the habenula is a relay center. In fact, go back to the thalamus and write thalamus, and that's a really important relay center for sensory and motor impulses. So it's a relay center. Action potential, sensory and motor passing upwards to the cerebrum and inferior from the cerebrum, eventually going to the spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system.
The brainstem is a vertically oriented stalk located between the diencephalon and the spinal cord. It can be divided into the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is the most rostral segment of the brainstem and has an important role in visual and auditory reflexes.
So go ahead and get midbrain, visual and auditory reflexes.
The pons is located caudal to the midbrain and is characterized by a prominent anterior bulge. It contains numerous ascending or descending fiber tracts. The cerebellar hemispheres are attached to the pons. The medulla oblongata extends from the pons to the foramen magnum, where it is continuous with the spinal cord. All nerve fibers traveling between the brain and spinal cord pass through the medulla oblongata. It also contains nuclei concerned with basic physiological functions, such as respiration, blood pressure, and heartbeat.
Important. So more brain anatomy. Let's look here. There's the frontal lobe. This is the central sulcus. I may have inadvertently called that the lateral sulcus, but that's the central sulcus, which separates the frontal, and of course there's prefrontal here, and then parietal. Again, sulcus, gyrus. The gyrus is tissue. The sulcus are these gaps. Boy, that's a good look at some facial bones as well. Let's see what else we have. There's the hypothalamus. So that's the hypothalamus. There's the corpus callosum. Joins the two hemispheres of the brain. Interesting side note, an early treatment for severe epilepsy, where the brain epilepsy, you could think of an epileptic seizure as an electrical storm occurring between the neurons with just uncontrolled neural firing, uncontrolled electrical storm of action potentials. So in severe cases, they would cut the corpus callosum to limit the seizure to one side of the brain. If the corpus callosum was cut, then the electrical storm, so to speak, was confined to one side of the brain and couldn't make it to the other side, which actually had some beneficial effects. They wouldn't be doing that now. This was, if I'm not mistaken, in the maybe 50s, late 50s maybe. Well, just perusing here, just looking at various structures. Again, there's the hypothalamus. There's the medulla oblongata. So medulla oblongata. Can you tell me what this structure is? And then what this structure is? All three are the brainstem. So there's the midbrain. There's the pons. You need to be able to tell me functions, midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Think of the medulla oblongata as vital bodily processes. Rate and depth of breathing, for example. So breathing. This is an important vasomotor center. Vasomotor center where control of, let's say, blood pressure is going to be real important. So vasomotor center and blood pressure, what does that mean? This region of the brain can dilate or constrict blood vessels. If the blood vessels are constricted, pressure goes up. If they're dilated, pressure, arterial pressure is going to go down. There's also a cardiac center here for heartbeat. This is, of course, vital bodily processes. And again, there it is, medulla oblongata. midbrain, pons. Great look at the pituitary gland there. Great look. Hypothalamus. Hypothalamus here. Thalamus. There's the parietal lobe. The entire brainstem. So the entire brainstem here. No structure and function. Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. There's the cerebellum. Boy, good look at the spinal cord. Zygomatic bone, cheekbone, maxilla, mandible.